It is good to join everyone today and be back on an office hour with something a little new to talk about this time. Is wanted to share with this community along with a few others as we get opportunities, just that we have finally gotten around to updating the EcoMap data products that the Forest Service produces. And so I'm going to be giving you a little bit of background on what that is, what that means, why would we do such a thing. Joanne will share a bit about how these data products are best used for framing and analyses and describing ecosystems at different scales. And then Estella is going to share where you can actually go to access this data, and wanting to share with this community partly because LANDFIRE data sets provide a really great way for characterizing these different ecological units that we map, depending on for different characteristics, and then also help leveraging a lot of LANDFIRE data when using these ecological units as analysis units and providing a way to describe them and characterize them in a data-driven way. And so that's why we're here. And so stepping way back for context is thinking about the importance of ecological mapping, because a lot goes into an ecosystem. And when we think about analyzing a landscape, really at any scale, we can think of a lot of different ways. I mean, there's a lot of different options for how to segment the landscape. How do we cut it up into reasonably sized units for the question that we're asking, to be able to look at differences from one place to another? Depending upon those purposes, you can consider watersheds, considering hexagons, right, Randy? And then also we can think about using ecosystems to segment the landscape. And depending upon our question and our purpose and our objective, there's a time and place for considering all of those different kinds of units. Within the Forest Service, a lot of times we care about the vegetation and the vegetation communities and how those communities interact with their abiotic environment, aka the ecosystem. And so we have within our policy manual, we have a standard. It's the National Hierarchical Framework of Ecological Units. Of course, that's a ridiculous mouthful to say on a regular basis, and so we often refer to it as the hierarchy. And this is mandated within our manual, 2060. And the reason for mandating mapping ecosystems and understanding where different ecosystems are located has to do with, our purpose as a land management agency. As we manage the land, it's really important to understand and evaluate how different areas have different capabilities, different suitability to different types of management actions. And understanding that helps define and explain why different areas may respond to the exact same management action, disturbance in very different ways. Underpinning all that is going to be the ecological relationships within that place. The soils, the geology, how those things interacted with the climate and inform the soils and how all of that interacts to ultimately, provide the foundation for plants and ultimately animals, and how all of those things interact with each other. So, being able to understand those factors allows for interpreting those relationships. And ultimately, by understanding that and having those descriptions, we can interpret how the landscape will respond, and we can improve how we do our management, how we consider managing for different objectives under our multi-use legislative obligation with the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act. And you might be like, well, that's nice, Sarah, but there's lots of different ecosystem mapping schemas out there. And some have been around a very long time, even much longer than the Forest Service. And there's a lot of consistency between them. But ultimately, what sets the Forest Service framework apart is how it considers ecosystems and ecological drivers from the very broadest of global scales, biomes, all the way down to very fine site and fine scale drivers. And that's really important in a management context. And then having a way to interconnect all of those scales together within a nested hierarchy. And so that's what makes the Forest Service version just a little bit different, is by design, creating a fully mapped system from the very finest of local scales, sometimes only a couple acres, all the way up to our large global biomes. Not that we have that fully developed at this point, but that's the framework, that's the design, that's what we are operating within in order to be relevant and to support our land management needs. So hierarchy and scale, my favorite thing to talk about. And so hierarchy broadly can be grouped into four big size classes, you can think of it. At the very broadest of scales, We have ecoregions. These are going to be our very largest of ecological regions out there, often millions of square miles, thousands of square miles. And so as we go from the very big units, if we have, of course, have very few of those to have global coverage. And then as we move down, we have smaller and smaller units, subregions being, occurring within ecoregions, landscapes occurring within subregions, and then land units being our finest scales at only a handful of acres at times. And so, of course, as the size of our units gets smaller, we have more and more of them. And the way that ends up looking is the hierarchy itself has 8 different levels spread across these kind of four large planning scales. And so at that very broad ecoregion scale, we have domains and divisions, which are really, up into that like biome type level. Then moving down provinces, we get into the subregional scales. We have sections and subsections. And then landscape scales is occupied by land type associations, with land types and land type phases making up the finest scales at that land unit or more local scale. And so what distinguishes these different ecological units across these different scales really comes down to thinking about our principal environmental factors and how they vary across, vary at a macro scale, more of a meso scale, and then ultimately at the micro scale. And as we look at the very broadest of scales with our domains, it's really ultimately temperature and really those global or continental scale precipitation patterns. And so you can see here, these are our main domains across the conterminous US. There's only 4, predominantly 2, and how temperature really distinguishes between domains and also precipitation. Moving down in scale, as we look at divisions, it's how those temperature and precipitation patterns ultimately play out with gross vegetation forms. Ultimately, tree cover is a major drive. What can support trees, what cannot support trees at all, is kind of how those things play out together and kind of they end up coinciding with that kind of question as we go down a scale into division. Going down further, looking at the provinces, this is a tinted elevation map, and you can see how we're really starting to pick out those really gross, really large geographic features, mountain ranges, and dividing that up. And then as we think about those major climate, physiography, vegetation, how those get more and more refined as we go finer and finer in scale. And then ultimately geology, soils, and all those things coming into play as we divide up provinces into sections, divide sections into subsections, and then ultimately get down to land type associations, land types, and land type phases. And so to map out this entire hierarchy, it's pretty big. It requires a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And so at the broadest of scales, and this is what we're talking about today, it's top-down. We're taking CONUS-wide data sets, using those to frame out these large ecological units and dividing those gradients along clean breaks and where ecologically meaningful changes occur. And this work started over 40 years ago and then became more solidified with the first version of EcoMap in the early 1990s. And that's what we'll be sharing today, is the data products that are produced through this top-down, data-driven mapping approach. And we refer to it as ECO. The counter to it, though, because you can only take that down so far and really do it at a national scale, is the bottom-up mapping that we do as an agency. And that bottom-up approach, working at the finest scales and aggregating them together to work your way up to larger units, is our Terrestrial Ecological Unit Inventory, or TUI, as we refer to it. And it's really these approaches working in tandem that's allowed us as an agency to build out the hierarchy as much as we can and fill it in as much as we can. Of course, when you have top down and bottom up, they at some point have to meet in the middle. And right now we're beginning to have the ability and the capability with improved data quality, improved computing power, to begin to do some of that top-down mapping beginning to verge into that land type association scale. However, there's still the need to have that bottom-up verification and truly bring the hierarchy together, which we hope to do at some point. And so today, but sharing with you the latest version of the EcoMap products, though, and all of these are going to be, these are those broader scales of the hierarchy. Getting a little bit ahead of myself here. And they're all of these broader scale products are wall-to-wall CONUS wide. We map them off Forest Service lands. We're trying to identify those continuous concepts and not be so hampered by administrative boundaries. On the flip side, when we're doing that bottom-up mapping, we are very focused on Forest Service lands. That's our prerogative and our obligation and responsibility to take care of those areas first. Although there have been cross-boundary mapping efforts over the decades, over the years. And the big reason for sharing this update at this particular time is that we wrapped it up last year through the publishing process earlier this year, and wanting folks to be aware of these updates because we haven't completed a full update of the EcoMap data products since 2007. And just a lot of things have kind of shifted and adjusted and improved with time. And so making some line adjustments in different places to recognize how we've been able to better characterize different environmental factors, have finer resolution products, and creating consistency with how those lines are drawn on maps, so some cartography, some data consistency. Also, there's been a lot of PUI work done. And so with the part of the hierarchy's design being truly nested, as those finer levels are mapped out, that adjusts. That requires some adjustment in the lines as you work your way up. And so trying to incorporate that work from finer scale mapping efforts throughout the country. And then another change that we made in this version of the EcoMap product is just updating codes and some of the naming conventions to make it a little bit more consistent. Historically, we recognized, especially at the province level, those different provinces that captured mountain ranges with an M prefix. But often when you're trying to code or organize data and you have everything being a three-digit numeric code except for a handful of mountainous areas, it became a little bit annoying to handle. And so we just adjusted the coding structure to account for that. And then making naming consistent throughout the country in style and formats. Some things would have a lot more adjectives, some were longer descriptions, just trying to standardize that. And so to share with you a bit of this new work and how this is getting put to use, I'm going to turn it over to Joanne.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. So I want to kind of start at the landscape scale and kind of work up and show some different products. And so Sarah brought up some really good points. When we're at that landscape or the land type association level, we're really focusing on NFS lands, although Sarah's done some great work with Stella and her larger team to start building out those LTAs. But here's the type of use we would use at that scale. And kind of we're looking at the landscape and we're trying to assess what's the condition of the ecosystem. And we've presented in the past to this group on the terrestrial condition assessment. But you can see our measurement there is the land type association and the variability across the NFS lands in the continental United States. And so this one's our overall condition, but you can start to see there's patterns and trends. Next slide, Sarah. And I did want to highlight for this, we use vegetation successional departure as one of our indicators. So the TCA is a set of indicators that we bring together in an overall condition, but we can also do a deep dive into different indicators. And here we're using that land type association, again, that landscape scale, and looking at using the LANDFIRE products, we use vegetation succession departure at that scale. So we are able to go in within each LTA and ask the question on NFS land, how far is the vegetation departed using BPSs in the existing veg layer from LANDFIRE. And again, you can start to see there's very clear patterns and trends. And so for us, this is probably one of the most frequent levels of the hierarchy that we use and use frequently, because this is then relates into one of our key performance indicators of how well are we maintaining these landscapes or the LTAs, how well are we improving and restoring them? And we use that as a measure every year. Next slide. So one of the reasons I didn't put any slides in for a land unit, which is our Landtype phase, which that's very much what stand am I standing in and what site am I in? What should that be? What should look like? What is its capabilities? And I think most people are really comfortable. They go out in the field, they take a plot, and you're really at that land unit, land type phase. Part of the bar, what Sarah brought out is, but we can start stepping that up because it's a hierarchy. And this is an example we used. So this is, and for some reason I lost the paper, but work done by Ben Knapp and Jacob Fraser and a whole team of folks looking at condition of shortleaf pine ecosystems across the range of the species. And so they built this work on NatureServe's Southern Open Pine Community matrices. So what those are is very similar to the TCA. It's a suite of indicators that you can use to evaluate condition based on a site. But then we can also take that same list of indicators and apply them to different data sets. And in this case, we use the overstory indicators to look at the condition of shortleaf pine ecosystem. And we've done the same work for longleaf pine. But you can start to see the trends. So it's taking a very plot data, and this one's based on FIA data, and starting to lump it up. And we were able to assess shortleaf pine ecosystems based on subsections. And so we could take this data set and do it at the LTA scale. We can then lump it up to the subsections and see trends. And that's really helpful, I think, for us to start. How do you prioritize the landscape? Are there trends? And you can clearly see from the graph on, it should be on your right side of the screen, the yellow is where we're seeing shortleaf pine has a reduced condition all the way to where, better condition down in the coastal plain where we seem to have a lot of fire on the ground and prescribed fire up into the southern apps where the darker blobs are, where there's a reduced condition in our shortleaf pine ecosystems. And so we can start to really look at those trends across the landscape instead of looking at each individual plot, which we can also do too if we need to. Next slide. So I like to point that out. That's using the hierarchy with our FIA data set. And it's one we find is really useful to go across multiple scales. We've been using our FIA data to do analysis at the national scale and lumping it up by division. And we can do it by province, and we can look at variability within the provinces within the divisions. And so back up at that eco-regional scale. We also find that scale, then we can start to talk about other classification systems and how we can work the two systems together to better understand the variability across the landscape. And so this is work that'll come out soon, hopefully in the next year, looking at the ecosystem and classification, but also the management of shortleaf pine ecosystems across the range. And in this one, we use the provinces or that ecoregion level of the hierarchy to look at group level of the US NVC. So the US and National Vegetation Classification Scheme is also hierarchical. We can look at it from the very site, association and alliances, up through groups, up through macro groups, and up through their hierarchy as well. And we can look at these two systems and see where their overlap is to better understand management across the landscape. And it just so happens that the group level of the NVC for shortleaf pine ecosystems matches really well with our province level. And we can then talk about trends in management at that broader scale. So we can take the same information, go all the way from the site, all the way up to the province, nested within both ecosystems, both hierarchies, to understand the systems, to understand what we're managing, and then how those can respond to management. And so that really gives us a robust tool, a variety of tools to really look at how we implement and how we think about our landscapes. The last two slides, what's been really nice about FIA plots and at these ecoregional scales of the hierarchy is we're looking at both private and public lands. So we're no longer restricted just to NFS lands. We can ask questions about NFS lands within those areas, but we're able to do a much broader analysis and give context to the specific lands that we're managing. And I think the next slide is on to Stella.
Thank you, Joanne. So I'm here to talk to you guys about how do you get this data? So where can you find the EcoMap data and how can you access it? So next slide, Sarah. So the Forest Service has FS Data Geo Clearinghouse portal. And on this site here, you can see on the side, there is going to be a link when you go to the landing page to download the data. So you're going to click that link. The next slide. And when you do, it's going to land to this page where you can search for the database. And what we find most useful is to do the keyword search. And you're going to type in the word eco. And then when you hit the go button, so next slide, this will bring up what data we have in for the EcoMap. You will be able to find the 5 data layers that we just talked about in the search filter. You will also still find the older edition, the 2007, which Sarah mentioned at the beginning here. So it gives folks time to transition over to using our updated products. So in here, you can download the data as a geodatabase or a shapefile, but we also have our data also on our EDW service. So next slide, Sarah. So this will allow you, so our EDW is our enterprise data warehouse. This will allow you to also bring the products directly into like an ArcGIS Pro session. You can bring it onto AGOL service. So you can bring it in that way as well. And I will leave you guys with the next slide with a beautiful map of our CONUS map of what the EcoMap looks like. And we did kind of put like a structure in there with like color coding the systems in it. So that is our lovely map showing the domains, the divisions, and the provinces. I have the sections and the subsections kind of like turned off in the background, but they're there. We can turn them on and you can zoom in, film as you go in. So with that, I believe we're ready for the questions. And I will drop the links in the chat.
This is Estella. That was my next question, the links. So thank you for putting those in there. I'll make sure that the links are in the description of our YouTube video recording. So
Thanks, Megan.
who has questions? We have a small group here, so feel free to just come off mute or no need to raise your hand or anything.
Hi, you all. Randy Swati here with the Nation Conservancy's LANDFIRE team. Thanks for this presentation. Great slides. So excited to see the evolution of this. Related to evolution, I've recently had a request to do a bunch of data summaries for the 2017 ecological sections. Those are sort of written into a forest certification standard. Probably cannot be changed easily, but I'm curious as to how, when I think this through, how your new sections have changed compared to the 2017 sections, and yeah, how I might go about communicating this to the partners I'm doing this work for.
Yeah, different parts of the country changed to somewhat different ways. Let's see here. Oh, I should have refreshed my brain just a little bit on this. First, I should back up and say that updating this was a very large team effort over the span of about a decade of mapping and incorporating data and making those adjustments. But by and large, at the section level, I think most of the changes, Joanne, I think there were some changes in the Southeast to better align with some different concepts down there. And then there was a fair number of changes up in the Northeast. And then at the subsection and section level, especially in the West, we made very, very few changes other than reducing multi-part segments. So there had been some concepts that really identifying individual kind of sort of the islands, think Sky Islands in the Southwest, but really trying to pull those out, especially if they were large enough to have discrete units. And so a little bit smaller, but still the same concept, just, recognizing the differences when they get separated, when different areas are separated by relatively large geographic distances, and how that then can, lead to differences in what the ecosystem is. And then we did shift around how a few things did end up getting lumped up, and it was to better capture just differences in major vegetation. So a lot of times looking at where trees can be supported, we are the Forest Service. And so that does become kind of a major demarcation, especially as it relates to temperature and precipitation. And then adjusting some lines to better capture where those gradients and breaks occur, and where they, especially how they're aligning with, geographic features, like where do you, trying to better identify where that line is for transitioning into a mountain range, which can be a little subjective at times, but trying to really refine that line work, I think, is the best way to describe it. So a lot of times what you would see in the older versions that had been at some point hand digitized, so pretty coarse lines, ultimately refining that line down to now what is following a sometimes a 10-meter digital elevation model, so a much finer stroke than somebody doing that hand digitizing at a pretty coarse scale. And so that's where a lot of the changes occurred between the 07 and 2025 maps.
The only other thing I would add is that they really brought some consistency to the size. So as you look at this map, the blobs look the same. One of the places you can really see that change is in Arkansas, where there are a lot of really small subsections and sections. And we really reevaluated that based on our current understanding, the work that's been done in the past 20 years, and made what we thought that would be more consistent across the country in size and scope and concept. And it's really, for me, the lumping that changed, not so much. I mean, lines did change, but trying to reflect. And I think the only other thing I'll add is where states have developed programs and concepts, we did try to align with them the best we could, as different places understand how we've learned to understand the response of these communities over the past 20 years. And the team did a great job.
Wow, Joanne. I just heard feedback on the old Arkansas sections just the other day. So funny you brought that up, and great work, you all. I really look forward to working with this, and cleaning up the multi-part polygons will just make everybody's work easier. So thanks for that too.
Yeah. And Randy, as you work with them, and really just an invitation to the LANDFIRE community, as folks work with them and have feedback on them, in theory, the idea is that this is a living product. We are still doing ecological mapping, especially at the finest scales. And the idea is that this should be updated on a 5 to 10 year basis. That was what was originally really put out there. And we've had major updates. The first major product was produced in the early 90s. Then there was a significant update right around 2000, and then another around 2007, and then it took us a bit to get this one fully put together. And so, but going forward, getting back to that, more regular updates, so that there's there'll be different vintages, but being able to account for, as data as other mapping, keeping that nested hierarchy, refining that work, keeping the concepts consistent nationally, and getting to that national consistency here. We want to have that feedback and dialogue about how people are describing their ecosystems, and understanding that, and keeping this relevant with especially as new data becomes available, new observations become available, finer scale mapping is completed.
Great, thank you. Who's next? You guys were so efficient with your time. Yeah, Jim, go for it.
Jim.
Back here. Okay, hi. Hi, Sarah. Hey, everybody. Sarah, I'm not even sure. I missed a little bit because I foolishly answered the phone a few minutes ago. So sorry if I missed this. But I was wondering how these units sort of correlate with FGBC, say NVC Group or something like that. I know we've talked about ecological systems, etc. But is there some analysis about how these may sort of overlay with NVC classes. Group would probably be the most common one, but perhaps not.
Yeah, I think it depends a bit at your scale, and I'd actually hand it over to Joanne, who keeps all the levels of the NVC clearer in her head than I do.
I find the group level really in the subsection through the province level. And the group level and the NVC makes a lot of sense to me when I'm looking at these at national scale and the landscape scale. And that's really where I spend most of my time thinking about these products. So I do think there is a lot of opportunity. When I was working with NatureServe and Carl and Don in particular on shortleaf pine and the open pine ecosystems and thinking about how do we think about shortleaf pine, there became that iterative process as we have all these folks working on it. Like there was one place in the Southern Alps that made no sense to me. And so we were able to work through all of those. Unfortunately, we were all doing the revision together. I find it really useful both to look at the FIA as we were mapping, but also to look at the group mapping that they were doing at the same time. And it helps us understand both these systems where we need to do refinement in whether it be the hierarchy or NVC, and really thinking about that. There are parts, if you work with the NVC, the riparian is really, for me, very fine. And for me, usually when I'm at a landscape scale, I'm like, yep, it's wet and it grows trees. But the NVC is very fine, and that's okay. That's important in the variability is, and the taxonomic variability and the composition and the species diversity is really important. And so we need to think about the levels we do that and what's important in those different systems. But I think using both tools is really important to understanding the landscape and informing each other. And they help identify the weaknesses in both. And it so happens I was working on both at the same time, or using both at the same time. So it really became a feedback loop and to help align those. So I think it's really a useful tool for me. I think the group level for management is usually where I like to hang out because it doesn't have too much variability, but it is a variability where we can make predictions about management's going to respond at the landscape scale, maybe not the site. And then you can step down to associations and alliances to or our Landtype phases. So I think I look at them as learning from each other where they don't overlap. But hopefully through time, all these systems will each have their strength and weakness, each have their own goal, but I do think they can learn from each other.
Well, thanks, Joanne. You said working with Carl and Don, did you review their map, their NVC map, or were you reviewing the concepts?
We were working on I haven't been involved in reviewing concepts. We were working the shortleaf open pine metrics and had some discussions around that. And then Don and Carl took that information and went into that. I used their group maps to help understand, like looking at different sections when we were lumping, because I had those draft products as well. So we've been using all their draft versions and providing feedback to them, but I wasn't directly involved in the review of the groups.
Okay. Thanks, Joanne.
Judith had a question. I'll read it. And Judith, feel free to come off mute and clarify anything. Is there any consideration about the areas where each side of the lines have devoted proponents and transitions are actively recorded? Lines are lines, but can be a bit muddy.
I think that's a great description of how to map of the challenge of mapping ecosystems, is that in so many places it is a gradient, it is a transition, and somewhere you have to put a line because you can look way over here and see that it's different and way over here. And so how do you make that call? And I think that's where there's that component of it being as much of an art as a science, and having a team do the work and having multiple perspectives and getting as many feedback loops as possible, whether that's within the team or in pulling in expertise outside of the team. And I think that's part of why I extend the invitation for feedback on the map, there are places where, does the line make sense a half mile the other direction? Probably. I won't lie. But it's using the data that we currently have, looking at those shifts in elevation, shifts in soils, shifts in geology, looking at how that then gets reflected in vegetation, how that gets reflected in even productivity, taking into consideration climate gradients in that, and trying to find where it's harmonized as best as possible. And that's part of the reason very excited about some of the finer scale mapping that was unfortunately going on, or fortunately, either way, kind of two sides of the same coin that were going on while we were doing these updates, is that many of that finer scale mapping work at the land type association level, the land type level, and the land type phase level is able to zoom into a landscape and better characterize it. And so of course, as both projects were trying to finish at the same time, it's really hard to incorporate what those final units will be. And part of the reason we are looking to do an update in the future, hopefully in a time frame shorter than 18 years. And why continued mapping is really important. Documenting what's out on the landscape now and looking at it in an integrated way, both soils and vegetation, and then being able to pull that into what we're doing. Although that's, getting tougher to do at the moment, but hoping to be able to do more of that in the future.
This is Judith, and part of my question is how I handle personalities that get very dogmatic about the situation when I'm sitting there trying to smooth it out and say, look, there are things that are going on that make this an art, and be patient and quit screaming at each other.
That is a challenge, Judith. I think part of getting these lines on the landscape is recognizing that biodiversity and in some ways trying to make them see the benefits of that and having areas with a lot of differences in one spot. Best of luck, though. There's always a lot of personalities in conversations.
Now, Judith, if you crack that nut, please let us know your answer.
At least they're a little careful with me because I'm so old, they think I'm fragile.
I have a feeling they're wrong about you, Judith. Okay, so Sarah, I have another question. You had mentioned 18 years since the last update. How long did this update take you? And what's next? You talked about the importance of continuous mapping. Are you hoping that, in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, you'll start the next iteration, or what's sort of next or on the horizon?
Yeah, actually, I have a folder on our shared systems of proposed changes and suggested ideas for the next revision already. Probably won't pursue that though until 2030 or so, just given the other things and giving this time to be out in the world and get feedback. But in the meantime, we even since really finalizing where these lines would land on the landscape, we finished up an LTA modeling effort with Estella's team at our geospatial office, and had a chance to actually work with Randy last summer on preliminary versions of that, early versions of those LTAs. And then finalizing them in parts of the country as we were working in other parts of the country with modeling. And those are first approximations. Those are a really good guess about where LTA lines would be. So one step down in scale from, this map is showing ecoregions and subregions. Land type associations are going to be at that next level down the landscape scale or mid-level. And simultaneously, there was additional work going on in the eastern region, looking at a few different units and trying to work more bottom up with land type phases, some similar data, some similar technology, and more ground verification going on out there of the concepts that they were modeling out. And so bringing in those projects that wrapped up last year weren't fully integrated into this work. And so that's step one. And then hoping that we can leverage those prior projects and do more work in parts of the country where the Forest Service hasn't been able to do as much ecological mapping. It has been very much a regionally led effort in different places. And so some regions have invested more, others invested less over time. and trying to help fill some of the holes in different places. We also have different LTA modeling projects and other work that or not modeling, but mapping work that was done in the past to bring in more fully into this project that we didn't do quite with this effort, as we were still working pretty top down, and so hoping to do a lot more of that finer scale mapping and have that inform this work going forward, and then also leveraging this current map in a lot of ways is the next steps. And so even doing work right now, looking at some, large scale ecosystem response to different management actions that we've taken and seeing, pretty sometimes, notable differences at both the province and section level for how different forest types will respond under different conditions. And so trying to work through those analyses and put this to use. And so that's really the next step for the next couple of years at least. But kind of keeping that archive of like this area, there's some parts of the map that I feel really good about. There's some parts of the map where it was like, just we had to finish it so that we could put out the parts we were really confident in. And so timeline wise, really just use this thing, get feedback on it over the next probably 2 to 3, 4 years, and then about 3, 4 years out, start finding the right individuals to pull together and think about what needs to be adjusted and changed. And maybe it's just pulling in work at finer scales. Maybe there's more significant changes that need to be addressed. We'll find out then.